5%. 5% of the law enforcement population. I think we're at maybe 350,000 officers. Don't quote me on that. So let's just say, give or take, 350,000 law enforcement officers, right, are working in this country today. I would say 5% of them are no good. From a list of they're just not good at the job, they might be corrupt, and they just have no business being police officers. They're not in it for the right reasons. Let's just say 5%, right? Let's say 5% are no good. No officer will question you on that. If you sit here and put a camera on the 5% and you always market the 5% and advertise the actions of the 5%, people are going to start to believe that the 5% represents the 95%. And the reality is they don't, right? They don't. We have to start scrutinizing the actions of that one officer that commits that one offense or does things incorrectly in that moment, and stop using that as a way to blanket the actions of all officers. Because that's one, it's unrealistic. One, it's illogical. And two, no one likes that. No one likes it done to them. And so let's look at it from this standpoint. All police officers are not created equal. I know it may be hard for some people to really conceptualize that, but the truth is there are some officers, that 5%, that just shouldn't be doing the job, right? Let's call that Officer Sprinkles. And Officer Sprinkles works at the Donut Police Department, right? In some random state, in some random city, some nearby county. Officer Sprinkles is not good at his job. Officer Sprinkles makes a mistake and someone films him making a mistake. Then you take that mistake and then you assume that every officer does it the same way. That's not true. All police officers are not created equal. There's a lot of nuances that makes up an officer. We're talking about from the upbringing, culture, religion, right? The officer's way of life, their value system. All those things incorporate an officer, and that officer uses those things that make up that officer, and they filter their performance, their behavior, their attitude, and their actions through those qualities that they have. Some officers don't have any good qualities. It is what it is. They're the 5%. The Officer Sprinkles. They're out here. And guess what? They're sprinkled all over the country. So what does that mean? That means that there are some officers, unfortunately, when they make an arrest or they're dealing with someone, they don't have the best temperament. Some of them aren't as patient. Some of them will curse you out. If you kick them in the shin, the 5% will probably body slam you. You're absolutely right, it happens. But the 95% won't do that. You know, there's a policy that's against that. You know what I mean? And every department has their own policy. And guess what? If Officer Sprinkle violates his own policy and the department, the Donut Police Department, allows it to happen, then the issue is with the police department, not with every single police department in the nation. We have to stop trying to blanket blame everybody. And you have to stop allowing these word wizards to get into your heart and your mind and in your spirit and conjure up all these false fairy tale type of situations to get this rise out of you and get you to act a certain way. Because essentially the message is rooted in this fear-mongering type of concept. And again, the issue is not the individual, the issue is the message. And we have to be mindful of these messages. I urge people to take an opportunity to kind of really look into these things a little further and stop allowing these word wizards to kind of get into your mind and start playing with your emotions. I've had people that I've had in handcuffs that resisted. They were passive resisting, right? And I've had people who were actively resisting, and those people did get body slammed and thrown around and tased and pepper sprayed and whatever else was available to me at the time. But it was all within reason. The force has to be reasonable and sometimes very necessary. But passive aggressiveness, nah. Passive resistance, no, not at all. And here's the thing, again, every officer's temperament is different. And sometimes you catch an officer on a very, very bad day, and that's no excuse. But the reality is that police officers are human, and we do make mistakes, you guys. We're not above mistakes. So, you know, this video and all that extra fluff wasn't necessary to get the point across. And here's the other and last issue that I have. Nothing about this was productive, right? How is this message that you're presenting used in a positive way? It's not. It's creating more contempt. It's creating more anger and frustration. And it's taken out of context. Why? Because you're not a law enforcement officer. You don't understand the job. You don't know how to translate a scene or a scenario or an incident involving police. And that's the problem. Too many people who know nothing about the job are speaking on it. And unfortunately, a lot of officers, majority of all officers, can't really comment on these things because it's against their policy, right? So who's really fighting back against these ridiculous narratives that are being put out, right? And that's what we want to do on this channel, and really challenge some of the ignorance that's being spewed across these different forms of media. Because a lot of these little channels out here that are really bashing officers, they're really kind of like the fingers of like the mainstream media, right? The fingertips of the mainstream media. And so again, pumping toxic poison through communities and the minds, especially of the Black community, because a lot of the content information put out is very disingenuous, right? We take real life things that do happen to people and then we try to exploit that. And the reality is, it's not a white or black thing. It's an officer who's gonna do his job properly, his or her job properly, and it's the citizen. Whether or not they're going to listen, right? Listen, follow instructions, and comply. Comply to survive. Can you do that? So it goes both ways. It goes both ways, and I agree with people and their frustration with a lot of law enforcement. They've had bad experiences with officers. A lot of that stuff is rooted in officers' professionalism. That's something that definitely needs to be discussed more. Is like, how professional are we with people, and just and what's our temperament like? We have to work on that as well. And it's difficult. It's so difficult. But we're human too, and the job is very difficult. It's taxing on the mind, body, and spirit, and we don't talk a lot about that, and things like that need to be discussed, right? Was this content productive? Let that be our focus. So when you put out content like this creates more division, creates more hate, it creates more anger and resentment. That's not helping the situation, right? Because you're trying to paint the picture as if it's white people against black people. No, we are all Americans in this country. There's a proper way for us to have this discussion, these dialogues. There's a proper way to hold police accountable, and there's a proper way to hold citizens accountable as well. And it starts with having an honest and respectful conversation, starting this dialogue in good faith, and both sides coming together and really talking about these situations. Because there are issues. There's issues on both sides, but we're not going to fix it, and we're not going to solve it by spreading hate, by fueling racism, and inciting people through fear tactics. We can look at some of the data, because guess what? The number doesn't lie. Let's look at the data. Officers assaulted. Because listen, and the reason I want to pull the data up, because it's not a laughing matter. It's not a joke. Officers assaulted a lot. They are assaulted a lot. Just in 2019, 56,000 officers were assaulted while performing their duties. Out of the 56,000, 17,188 sustained injuries. And right here it just breaks down, 24% of those were attacked by personal weapons, was considered hands and feet. 8.8% were assaulted by knives. 5.6% were attacked with firearms. 15% attacked with other dangerous weapons. That could be like a bat, some type of an object, even sometimes a vehicle. So interesting enough. But for some of our naysayers, because a lot of people like to compare black and white all the time when it comes to law enforcement encounters. But let's take the arrest stats, because he kind of joked around about the black people being arrested and thrown on the ground. Listen, we have to talk about in our community about how we behave when we are in the presence of an officer, or how do we behave in a scenario where we are going to be placed under arrest. What is our actions like? Do we comply? Or are we oftentimes going to be aggressive? Or are we going to resist? And your behavior will determine the outcome. See, police officers are very reactive in nature. But let's look at the stats. This for arrests. 2019, 69.4% of individuals arrested were white, and 26.6% were black African American males. 26%. arrested. Of juveniles, 2019, 62.5% were white, and juvenile black males, 33.9%. Okay, this is interesting. Here's one of the things that we have to also look at. You know, unfortunately, the black community, or black men, majority, commit half of all the murders in this country annually. That's a problem, because being only 13%, we commit half of the murders. But not even just 13%, I would say even 6%, because I want to say roughly 6% of the 13% are men in our community. So, and majority of murders committed by men. So you can easily say that the 6% are committing 50% of the murders in this country. Let's see, white people account for 45.7% of the murders. Juveniles, very even. Here's the problem. The black community, we're committing 50% of the crime. We're only 13% of the population. That's an issue. So when we talk about police encounters, and when you talk about, black men and women, or black people are being slammed by the police or tased and things. Well, let's look at the crime. We have to look at the crime and what types of crime, right? There's so much that needs to be looked at when we see how our officers responding. Was the person resisting? Was the person armed? Were they complying? Were they not complying? All those things you need to ask. So anyways, these are just stats. I'll put them in the description section. Okay, so let's continue on with the video.
It's wild whenever you see the police actually behave like civil servants instead of jackbooted authoritarian thugs, which is generally the case when they come and they service our communities. But, look, this lady is a non-threat. She's a...
And that's not 100% accurate whatsoever. Very misleading information. Why is that? I've spent half my career working in a predominantly black community in Georgia, and I'm gonna be completely honest with you. What I've noticed from my experience, and a lot of officers can attest to this, is that we don't comply, right? We are extremely aggressive towards authority, and when we do commit crimes, even the most violent ones, we can be very difficult to deal with, and even on the non-violent crimes, we can be very difficult to deal with as a people. So, as a community, we have to really start being honest and having real conversations about how our community responds to law enforcement, responds to authority. And here's the kicker, right? I worked in a predominantly black community with a predominantly black police force that was policing in a predominantly black community. And I'll tell you this, we were insulted by our own people. We were called Uncle Tom, we were called sellouts. And mind you, we're investigating crimes committed against other black people. Now, of course, the victims loved us, right? And guess who called, right? You had black victims calling on black suspects. So this narrative that police officers are going to these communities and just kind of treating black people poorly, it's very inaccurate. It's disingenuous, and it's disinformation. And we have to start speaking out about it. It is what it is. There are people in the black community who love officers that reflect them, who look like them in our own communities. And unfortunately, there are some communities where you have predominantly more white police officers that are enforcing laws in black communities. Now, if you want those things to change, it's on us to put ourselves in those positions, but a lot of us don't want to do the job. Another thing too is, just because you have an officer that's white, he or she is enforcing the law on you doesn't make them a racist. And a lot of times what I see is people have issues with officers' professionalism. They have an issue with officers being very insensitive. And because you have a white officer that's insensitive doesn't make them a racist, right? We've gotten too cavalier with calling people racist all the time because we don't like what they say, or we don't like how they are enforcing law. Listen, if they're not good at their job, they're not good at their job. But because you don't like what they said, or they were very rude, or they cursed at you, doesn't make them a racist. So we have to start calling it what it is. And that's not to say that there aren't any racist people or racist cops. I'm pretty sure there are. Matter of fact, I know that there are, but they represent that 5% we were talking about earlier. And we just have to stop, you know, we just have to stop with that. It's not helping us. This type of dialogue is not helping. And again, once again, this video has not produced anything positive or provided any solutions, or hasn't moved the needle forward whatsoever. It's kind of
she can't physically take any of these guys down, and so they treated her as a non-threat. But it's funny how selective they are about non-threat. Choose to decide is somebody that doesn't need to be tackled or clotheslined or put in a chokehold. But yeah, it's interesting.
Easy. People who comply, right? And here's the thing too, every officer is different. And again, you know, I can't stress that enough. My threshold and my tolerance is different than the next officer that I'm standing next to. Everybody is different. Unfortunately, we've seen cases where officers have kicked people on the ground, in the face, and handcuffed. Unacceptable. We've seen that. White and black. We've seen it on white officers, on white people. We've seen it both ways. You don't know about it because the media doesn't share it, but it happens. White people get the same unfair treatment when officers do their job poorly. White people get it just as bad as black people. It's never televised.
To watch this lady kick the hell out of these cops.
Kicked who? See? It's so easy to take something and then put your fairy tale spin on it. We're watching the same video? Exaggerations.
And they just take it.
Yeah, and we've seen cops do takedowns of 10-year-olds, 11-year-olds, 12-year-olds who happen to be black. We've seen them engage in chokeholds. We've seen them engage in tackles of young children who are being aggressive at that moment. When the same thing applies that you just said, these kids were too light to do it.
It happens to white kids too. Please don't let me do a video where I have to showcase white children being tossed around by police officers. Again, I'm gonna be completely honest with you. Some officers lack the temperament. That 5%, you know, these officer sprinkles, they're very sensitive and they don't need to be doing the job. Unfortunately, I've seen people get the best of some of the greatest officers. Had a coworker one time, was arresting a burglary suspect, and the burglar was a black male and the officer was black, and the suspect spit in the officer's face, and the officer took his right hand and met him in the face and dropped him, and the officer lost his job. But I say that to say that that was a black on black thing. It happens, man. Sometimes you lose your cool. It's not okay, but it happens. That's just the reality of it. But of course, you're not gonna hear about that.
Damn thing to these cops, but that did not matter to the cop that was on the scene.
Well, and there you have it. Let me end by saying this. Unfortunately, we live in a country where we have people who are incentivized financially to push a lot of rhetoric that isn't true, a lot of disingenuous information. Listen, there are officers that aren't good at their job. They represent the 5%. Let's give them the 5%. They're not that great at their job for whatever reason. The media has a way of wanting to market those 5% and then ignore the 95. The 95 are out here doing an amazing job every single day, protecting, serving, and sacrificing. We have to start acknowledging and bring counterbalance to the negativity that's being presented on a daily basis. Because I'm gonna tell you right now, that conversation is not helping, right? It's conversations like that we have to really meet and say, let's talk truth. We need to have law enforcement officers who have the actual experience talk about these things. I've heard people talk about the data, but you don't do the job, don't understand how to even really properly identify what's being said in that data because you don't know what the job entails. So listen, let me bring it back with the word of wisdom. Complaining doesn't solve the problem. Let's start talking about solutions. And solutions are gonna start with having positive and healthy relationships and transparency and understanding. In order for us to rebuild and to grow and to do this thing together, we have to respect one another. Listen, you guys, I'm out. This is a great review. I hope you like. Please take a moment to subscribe and like and share this video. Let's start putting out some positive information and let's start combating the negative one. Thank you again for your time. I wish you all the best. God bless.